I have no idea what Bret's got on his plate, but it's going to be a delicious meal. That's all I can tell you. So stay awake and eat that steak. You know, it's the steak of life.
I'm not sure I'm any more organized than Louis is, or was, but he seemed pretty organized to me, so I'm hoping the Spirit will organize what I'm going to say. Someone came up to me this morning and asked me about a question of, well, how did Satan become Satan, and why did Satan have to be? And, so I thought I would start there, but I really have to go back a little further back with and it's going to sound almost heretical question, how did God become the God that he is? And, God, wasn't he always good and loving and just, and isn't he always loved by nature? And I was reading a confession of faith by there's a new global Methodist church that's coming into being because the United Methodists are splitting and the conservatives are forming their own denomination. And one of the statements in the statement of faith was that God is by nature love. And it's like, well, does that mean he had no choice in the matter? And, in thinking about that, the statement of faith was saying that God is by nature love. And I was like, well, does that mean God has no choice in the matter? And that would seem to make human beings superior to God, because if we can choose between good and evil, and God can't, that just seems to me to reduce God to the level of my dog. My dog has a personality and has emotions, perhaps of a kind, but my dogs don't choose between good and evil. They have no awareness of right and wrong. They don't hesitate to, steal each other's food out of the bowl, and there's no real guilt about it. That's the nature of dogs. Dog eat dog world, they say. And it's like, well, am I going to reduce God to a dog? Dogs seem to be loving in some outward sense and, lick you and have affection, but I don't think of God's love at the level of a dog's love. And so I think that saying that God is just loving, is loved by nature, really doesn't explain who God is. God ultimately has to be a moral God. No, nobody's going to say God is immoral, and nobody wants to say that God is amoral, that is, doesn't have morals at all. God is a moral being. That implies some kind of choice that God makes to be goodness, to be love. So when John in his first letter says God is love, he is love because he chooses to be love. He's not love because he has to be love. That to me really is reductionistic. And the same with light and darkness. God chooses to be the light and chooses not to be darkness. So when he says in 1 John, God is light and in him there is no darkness at all, it's because he has chosen for his character to be one of love and light and goodness, and not one of darkness and evil and just, mere power over the others for the sheer joy of exercising arbitrary power. And there are some Christian traditions, specifically Calvinism, where God just simply exercises arbitrary power over people for the sake of exercising arbitrary power. He just decides, okay, you're going to heaven and you're going to go to hell. And you don't have any choice about it. In fact, the choice you make to receive me is because I ordained before the foundation of the world that you were going to make that choice. But you're still responsible. Say that again? That doesn't make any sense at all. No, God is not arbitrarily love, and he's not just arbitrary power. He chooses to be the kind of God that he is. And so I'm going to bring up a concept that is somewhat difficult for people to understand, is that in eternity, and this is outside of time, there is this thing the mystic Jacob Burma calls the free sea of nothingness. And I like to call it the divine imagination, because in the free sea of nothingness, it contains all possibilities, all potentialities, and it's nothing in particular, but it's everything in general. So all possibilities, in fact, all ideas ever existed in the divine imagination, in this sea of nothingness, so that even the idea of evil existed before Satan ever brought it into being. Satan didn't create the idea of evil. It had to exist. Otherwise, Satan was creating something that God knew nothing about, God had no control over, and ultimately makes Satan an evil creator alongside a good creator. But no, that's not what Satan is. And we'll get to what Satan is and what he did in a moment. But basically, in order for God to be a moral God, both possibilities had to exist as potentials for him to choose. And so God could have chosen to be this arbitrary, all-powerful self for self, and just created human beings for the sake of striking them down like bugs with lightning bolts and going, smashing you for the cockroaches that you are, and that could have just been the kind of God he chose to be. And he could have chosen to be that kind of God. And incidentally, for those of you, who grew up with that kind of God, that's not God. That's the pagan god Zeus who struck people with lightning bolts. That's not the God of Scripture. But anyway, Zeus is modeled on Satan. It's not modeled on the biblical God. No, God chose to be love. Well, is there any evidence for that in Scripture? Well, in Exodus, and I think it's 33, this is in the context of this is about the sin of the golden calf. And Israel breaks the command not to make an idol. And they make an idol out of gold of this calf, because a calf was the symbol of the god El. And of course, Abraham knew him as El Shaddai, or El Elyon. And so the Canaanites, he was the high god of the Canaanite pantheon, and he was always portrayed as a golden calf or a golden bull. And of course, the Israelites, who had come out of Canaan and went into Egypt, they still used idols. I mean, they never really repented of idolatry. And so when God delivered them from Egypt, they were going to make an idol of God out of gold. But of course, God forbade that in one of the Ten Commandments. And in fact, idolatry, either the worship of other gods or the worship of images made to look like God, making any image that reduces God to the level of a thing, is forbidden, and in fact breaks the covenant between Israel and God. It wasn't like ordinary sins. This was a covenant-breaking sin. This ultimately, God threatens Moses and the Israelites that he is no longer going to send his glory in their midst. His presence is no longer going to go with them. In fact, actually, he says to Moses, "Let me at them, that I might destroy them." His wrath burns hot against the children of Israel, and he is going to destroy them. Now, I think that what God is doing here is he's really testing Moses. He is really presenting Moses with the opposites and presenting himself as a consuming fire to Moses that burns hot and is going to destroy the Israelites. And they deserve to be destroyed. That's unquestionable. Moses offers, and in fact, I think that Moses here is a vessel of God's love in offering him his own life and to be blotted out of the book of life if God will relent and not punish the children of Israel. But God refuses the sacrifice of Moses because Moses is not a worthy sacrifice. Moses himself is a sinner. He can't offer himself. He is not a perfect, flawless sacrifice, but yet he's still an expression of divine love. And so ultimately Moses persists and argues that what will the Egyptians say that you brought them out only to destroy them and the reputation of God? He doesn't say, these poor people and how they're going to suffer. No, nothing on the basis of anything in the Israelites. The Israelites do not deserve mercy. They deserve to be destroyed. And that's the same with us. We deserve to be destroyed because of sin. He appeals to God's name for your own name's sake, for your own glory's sake, not to destroy this people, and for his presence and glory to continue to go among the people. And so God relents and ultimately says, 33:14, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. And his presence is his glory. And so Moses asks to see God's glory, and God responds, 33:19, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you my name, the Lord, or Yahweh. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. And how I understand this is not that, okay, I'm going to arbitrarily pick a few people, I'm going to be merciful to them and not to others. And that's how Calvinists understand the verse. I understand it is more, I will be gracious because I am gracious. I will be merciful because I choose to show mercy. And so he is making a choice to be loving, merciful, and compassionate to the people of Israel and forgive their sin, and for his presence to go in their midst rather than choosing to consume them. And so you'll remember back in Exodus 3 when God declares his name to Moses, I am, and he appears in the burning bush as a non-consuming fire. Behold, the bush was on fire and it was not consumed. And so God chooses to be a non-consuming fire rather than a consuming fire. Now this is the choice whether or not to have wrath or to have mercy, whether to destroy or to love. But in eternity, God makes a choice to be either self for self or self for others. And by saying it's in eternity, I mean God is perpetually choosing outside of time to be love rather than hate or arbitrary power. He's choosing to be light rather than darkness. And that's because God is a moral God. I want to step back for a moment and say, without, in fact, this moral choice, there is no spiritual consciousness. It's the ability to make a moral choice between good and evil, light and darkness, love and hate, that ultimately makes someone a spirit, a conscious spiritual being. That's what spiritual consciousness really consists of. And without it, you're no better than an animal, or maybe even worse, a thing or an object. That is absolutely critical. And so the origin of evil really begins back in the choice of God. Not that there's any evil in God. God doesn't choose evil. God doesn't choose darkness, and in him there is no darkness at all, as John says in his first letter. But that's because he chooses not to be darkness. Satan, however, chooses something differently. and chooses something different. And what Satan opens up is a possibility that God denied or rejected. But in fact, while Satan believes that he is an independent self, he really isn't, because the potentiality exists in God. The choice that Satan is making between these two possibilities and what has become God's nature and what will become Satan's nature is really in God. Even Satan is making his choice in God, paradoxically. So Satan is expressing the choice that God denied. He's expressing the reverse. He's God in reverse. So he's not independent of God, even though he thinks he's making an independent choice. God chose to be love. Satan chooses to be arbitrary power, wrath, because he thinks, because when God made the choice, he became the crucified lamb, the slain lamb from eternity. And what I believe is that Satan thought God was weak. The weakness of God is more powerful than the strength of men. But Satan didn't know that. Satan didn't understand the wisdom of God. He thought that, well, if I reach for power, then I can be God. I can be more powerful than God. And certainly in appearance, and certainly in the experience of the world and all human experience, it sometimes seems like evil and wrath are far more powerful than the power of love. I mean, you look at the cross, you look at the crucifixion of Jesus, and the love of Jesus seems weak and powerless compared to the power of the Romans and the Jewish authorities to crucify him. But the lords of this age did not understand the wisdom of God. They did not see that the weakness of God was much more powerful than any power that Satan could operate through these earthly powers, because the lords of this age are both spiritual lords and political lords, and both were brought down to nothing by the crucifixion. The slain lamb is the most powerful force in the universe. Love is the most powerful force in the universe. Self-sacrificial love is the most powerful force in the universe. So I thought I would read, I know that Sylvia read from these passages of Scripture earlier, Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 about the devil. Technically, they are about the king of Babylon and the king of Tyre, but the king of Babylon and the king of Tyre embody the spirit of Satan. They are outward expressions of this inner spirit. So before I get there, I want to go back to that question, about how did Satan become Satan? Why did he have to be? Because there had to be a choice between good and evil. Without that choice, there is no spiritual consciousness. We would not be persons, and we'd have, there'd be no morality. We'd just be animals. We'd have nothing, there'd be nothing other than, I suppose animals, we'd be peacefully grazing around like cows. We'd have no sense of good and evil. And so, in a way, Satan has to be to open up the possibility of evil. And so he brings that possibility of evil into reality. He brings it into manifestation. And so it becomes a second deity nature. Norman talked about instead of two human natures, two deity natures. But the deity natures, it's not that it's the character of God, but that Satan has brought something into manifestation out of the divine imagination, something that was never meant to be. But it's not God's character, but it's still an expression of God in reverse. We have the nature of Christ, and we have now the nature of Antichrist. And so Antichrist is always dependent on his opposite, for its reality. And God willed this state of events to be. I mean, who placed the serpent in the Garden of Eden? Well, if it wasn't God. God could have stopped Satan from ever entering the Garden of Eden and stopped the temptation from ever happening. But that wasn't God's will. God's will was for Adam and Eve to face the choice. They had to face the choice to become mature sons of God, or else remain merely animals. Maybe more intelligent animals, but they wouldn't have been anything more than, like a border collie, a very intelligent dog. Supposed to be the most intelligent breed. But that's not what God wanted. God wanted sons, a family of mature sons who would choose good rather than evil and have the cross of God, of the slain lamb, in their own hearts, so they would be expressions of the choice that God made. They would make the same choice God made and express the nature that God chose to be, and not the nature that God rejected. Okay, so I'll read from Isaiah 14. Here it is. I'll start with verse 12. How you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn. How you are cut to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will send above the heights of the cloud. I will make myself like the Most High. But you were brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the one who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms and made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities? Wow. So, as Sylvia mentioned, there's about 5 times where it's I. Self-glorifying. He is going to replace God. I don't think it means that he's going to be like the Most High in the sense of he wants to be loved. No, he thinks that love is weak. He wants to be like the Most High in terms of his power and his position. He wants to raise his throne above the angels, all the other angels. See, in heaven, there's a divine council of angels. There's God, and then there are all the other angels that sometimes Scripture actually calls gods, Elohim. In Psalm 82, ye are gods, is actually talking about the fallen members of the angelic members of the divine council. And if you want to know about that, you can read Michael Heiser's books, and he talks about that quite a bit. And they're the origin of the fallen principalities and powers. And Satan wanted to rule as chief among them, not only chief among them, but raise himself over them and over God. And that's why it's the Mount of Assembly, is the assembly of the gods. But he's going to be brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. I'd like to now turn to Ezekiel 28, which describes the king of Tyre in very similar terms. Ezekiel 28:2, the prince of Tyre says, because your heart is proud and you have said, I am a god, I sit in the seat, the throne of the gods, in the heart of the seas. But you are a man and no God, though you make your heart like the heart of a god. And then skipping ahead to verse 11 or 12, Son of man, God is saying to Ezekiel, calling him Son of man, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre and say to him, thus says the Lord God. And what follows doesn't really apply to the king of Tyre, it's to the spirit indwelling the king of Tyre. He says, you were the seal of perfection, like a signet ring, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Well, we know that the king of Tyre wasn't in the Garden of Eden, so we know it has to be somebody else. And he later calls, in verse 16, he calls him a cherub, which is a guardian warrior, guardian angel. So he says, you were in Eden, the garden of God, and every precious stone was your covering. And I'm going to skip ahead. You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, till unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. And so I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. So I cast you to the ground. I exposed you before kings to feast their eyes upon you. So I brought fire out of your midst, and it consumed you, and I turned you to ashes on the earth in the sight of all who saw you. All who know you among the peoples are appalled at you. You have come to a dreadful end and shall be no more forever. So that describes the ultimate end of Satan. But he describes how Satan was in Eden, the garden of God. He was an anointed guardian cherub. He was like one of the 4 guardian cherubs of the throne of God, the 4 closest to the throne of God. And he was covered with precious stones. And in the midst of the stones of fire you walked, and I believe those represent angels there. And his heart became proud on account of his beauty. And what happens is that he turns his eyes away from God and from worshiping God as the source of all beauty. God is beauty. God is the beautiful one. And so he turned his eyes towards himself. And I think it's Martin Luther who called sin he calls it sin. It curves the person inward upon themselves. It's really, sin is self-worship. And so he corrupts his wisdom for the sake of his own splendor. So he's so impressed with himself and his own glory, and that really is what leads him to decide, oh, I'm really this great and glorious being. I'm going to raise my throne above the stars of God. I can be like the Most High. I can replace God. And in fact, we have this reflected in pagan myths where the Greek god Saturn, or Kronos, overthrows his father Uranus, and then the Greek god Jupiter overthrows his father Saturn, or Kronos. And so in the pagan myths, this is even reflected of Satan's attempt to overthrow God. And in fact, actually, Satan, it's also reflected in the myth of Prometheus, where Prometheus tries to steal the fire of the gods. Well, that Satan tried to steal the fire, the consuming fire of God, and to be God himself, to be the consuming fire. But instead of that, what happened is that God brought fire from out of your midst, and it consumed you, and I turned you to ashes on the earth. And so Satan has become the consuming fire of wrath, and ultimately it will consume him in the lake of fire. But this is really, so what really happened is that Satan opened up something that was never meant to be, though God, of course, foreknew it in his wisdom that it would come to be. He opened up another nature, another deity nature, and a nature of evil, of seeking power for its own sake. I think of, whether you've read the books or you've seen the movies of the Lord of the Rings, the Ring of Power, and Satan grasped for this ring of power. So it's power seeking without love, and not realizing that the real power is in self-sacrificial love, but just in exercising arbitrary power over others. So we come to the garden. Satan is still in the garden. He's fallen, and now he's come, and it's like, oh, I need people to express myself through. And so God creates Adam and Eve, and God deliberately creates two trees in the garden and tells Adam and Eve not to eat out of one of them. Now, there's nothing magical about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's actually Satan's lie that there's any wisdom to be gained from eating of this tree. And it was probably a fig tree, not an apple tree, because they covered themselves with fig leaves. Well, where did they get the fig leaves from? From the tree they were right next to. And apple trees don't really grow in the ancient Near East, so it probably was not apples. It was a fig, but that's neither here nor there. But the point is that God deliberately sets the two trees in the middle of the garden so to make Adam and Eve choose. And in fact, if they chose rightly, they would have been brought to maturity as sons and son and daughter of God. Because then they would have made the right choice, and the right choice would have been fixed in them. But they didn't, and God foreknew that they would not make the right choice. But they had to have that choice, or they wouldn't be moral beings and they wouldn't be persons. And that's absolutely critical if you're going to be made in the image and likeness of God, and God makes a choice, then human beings have to make that same choice or that same kind of choice. And conversely, that if human beings make moral choices and we're made in God's image, that implies that God is a moral being who makes a moral choice. So it works both ways. So I'd like to turn to Genesis 3. You see, really, to understand what Christ did on the cross, you have to really understand what went wrong and how the cross reverses it. If you don't understand what went wrong in the first place, then you can't really understand what Christ did. And that's the reason for the rather paltry way that the gospel is presented in the churches, is because they don't really know what went wrong, and so they can't really tell us how to get it right, because they don't know what's wrong. They just know that, well, we sin all the time, and Jesus forgives our sins and atones for our sins so God can forgive us. And to me, that doesn't deal with the root of the problem. It just deals with the fruit of the problem, not the root of the problem. So I'd like to read from Genesis 3. Now the serpent was more crafty or cunning than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. Well, that should give us a clue here that he's not talking about a little snake. It's not a garter snake he's talking about, and it's not even a python or an anaconda or whatever, a cobra. No, he's talking about a spiritual being here. And I think that Satan appeared as a flying serpent because at the end, one of the curses is to crawl on the earth and on the dust of the ground. And in fact, there are pagan myths that, like among the Mayans and the Aztecs, they worshipped a god, Quetzalcoatl, that was a flying serpent. And so I think that throughout, there's human memories, vague human memories preserved in pagan myths of these events, or of Satan as a flying serpent. And so the serpent says to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?" Well, you see here, he's already chosen to be a liar, which is what God cannot be. And as Sylvia brought out earlier, God cannot lie, and is mentioned several times in Scripture. God cannot lie because he chooses not to be a liar. He has made a fixed eternal choice. It's not just, well, he can't lie because he can't get the words out of his mouth, or because he's mute, or he's dumb. It's because he's chosen not to be a liar. Whereas Satan has chosen power at any root, and it doesn't matter whether it's never love, but he doesn't care whether it's loving or not. It's just in terms of what Satan is, I'm going to get what I want at any cost to anyone. And that's the essence of self for self. You shall not eat of any tree in the garden? Of course, that's a total lie. I mean, he told him, you cannot eat of the tree that's in the center of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, which is true. But God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. Well, God didn't technically say you can't touch it, and I suppose that's an addition, but the real problem with what Eve says here is that there's actually two trees in the middle of the garden, not just one. And God did not say you can't eat of any tree in the midst of the garden either. He just simply said you can't eat of this tree in the middle of the garden. And so already Eve is wrong. I don't know the reasons why she's wrong. Maybe she didn't understand what Adam told her. It never says that God commanded Eve directly. But given that she already has it wrong, it's already bad news. Because she doesn't, let me go check with God as to what he actually commanded. Or let me go check with my husband, what did God actually say? You know, it's sort of like an interrogation a leading interrogation where you don't have a lawyer present, and so you can be manipulated into saying all sorts of things that you don't mean. And that's why you're supposed to have a lawyer present if you're being interrogated. Well, Satan is interrogating her, and so he's leading her down a path. He's deceiving her. And he really did. Paul says in Timothy that Eve was deceived. But the serpent says to the woman, now he just flat out contradicts God. You will not surely die. And in Hebrew, it's die. It's a double die. And I think that's the origin of the second death. It's not just simply you will physically die. It's you will die. You will eternally, spiritually die. And the serpent is denying this because, Satan didn't die when he grasped for the fire of God. So, not yet, but he will. And so Eve isn't going to die the instant she disobeys God, or does she? In fact, she does. For God knows, Satan says, when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. We've heard about being like God before. I read it in Isaiah 14, I will be like the Most High. And here he's promising her that she would know good and evil. Knowing good and evil just means knowing right from wrong. It's a neutral concept. There's nothing wrong with knowing right from wrong. That's a good thing. Unless it's knowing good and evil independently from God. That is, you decide for yourself what good and evil are based upon your own self-interest. And at the end of the book of Judges, it says that the Israelites did what was right in their own eyes. And so they became the standard of right and wrong, and they were following the serpent, the Israelites. And so that's why they ended up in Baal worship and worshiping idols. So basically what Satan is promising is that they will be, to the Eve, was that she would be like God. And she would know good and evil for herself, and she would be the source of her own wisdom. She wouldn't have to rely on the wisdom of God, because the other tree was the tree of life, which is a tree of life. Wisdom is a tree of life in the book of Proverbs. She wouldn't have to rely on God. She'd get to rely on herself. So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the tree of self-reliance, the tree of independent self. And so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and it was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was desired to make one wise. So it was delightful to look at, and it was good for food, and it could bring wisdom. Well, why didn't she think about, if the tree of life was certainly meant to be wisdom, why didn't that seem desirable for gaining wisdom? And I was thinking, I think this was earlier while Sylvia was talking, I had the thought that because the tree of life is the cross. And so the tree of life, while it's supposedly a tree of life, it looks like death. It doesn't look like this. Maybe it had some fruit hanging from it, but they didn't look all that inviting to the flesh, to our body and soul. It looked like maybe it was like it had prunes instead of figs. Something that's like, okay, it's healthy for you, but you don't really love it or anything. Whereas the figs on the tree of knowledge, just it was full of these wonderful leaves. It didn't look like it was dying or dead. It looked like it should provide much better wisdom than the tree of life, because the tree of life is the tree of the slain lamb, the tree of the cross, and that life comes out of apparent death. And so I think that's why Satan was able to make the tree of knowledge look so tempting to her, was because it looked so much better. And she gave in to her fleshly perceptions and desires, and she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. And the eyes of both of them were opened. That's a curious thing, because what they did acquire wisdom. It was the wrong wisdom. It was the demonic wisdom that James talks about. But they did get wisdom, and their eyes were opened to the wrong possibility, to the wrong nature. And so they became expressors of the nature of Satan. You might say, hold on here. It doesn't say anything about expressors of Satan's nature. But think about eating for a moment. Eating is a symbol of union. When you ingest something, it becomes part of you. I grew up hearing on ads on television all the time, you are what you eat. You join yourself to what you eat. It becomes you, and you become it. And so when they ate of the tree of knowledge, they ingested the wisdom of Satan. And they became one with Satan. In fact, actually, all union is by faith. And what they did is, instead of believing the word of God, the command and promise of God, they believed the word of Satan. And by believing the word of Satan and ingesting his wisdom, they became expressions of him and of his wisdom. Instead of what they were meant to be, expressions of the divine glory, that if they had ingested of the tree of life, they would have been expressions of God's glorious wisdom. So the two trees really represent the two wisdoms, the two minds, the mind of Christ and the mind of Satan, the nature of Christ, the nature of Satan. So what happened is that Adam and Eve made a covenant with Satan. And a covenant is sort of like an agreement, a contract that they entered into with obligations. And covenant really unites you with the person you are entering into covenant with. A marriage covenant. You're united and you become one flesh. Well, if you unite yourself with Satan and you believe his words and you ingest what he's saying and make it part of you, you enter into a marriage covenant with the devil. And that's what happened to Adam and Eve. And they were acting on behalf of all humanity and all his descendants. And so all of us entered into this covenant. And later in Isaiah, it talks about a covenant with death. And that's really what happened, is we entered into a covenant with death. And the devil in Hebrews 2 is described as he who holds the power of death. We live all our lives in slavery to the fear of death, because we're held in slavery by him who holds the power of death. So he is death personified. He is the angel of death that went around and killed all the firstborn of the Egyptians. And the blood of the lamb that was placed over the lintel of the doors on the Passover was a sign to the angel of death that these people are protected by the blood of the lamb, and he could not touch the firstborn in those houses. And so in the same way, the blood of the lamb protects us from the power of Satan, from him who holds the power of death. But anyway, to get back to Genesis 3. So humanity entered into this covenant with the evil one. As a result of this, also, what happened is to humanity is that they became flesh. And Paul particularly uses this term flesh. He uses it with a variety of different meanings, but when he uses it with an evil or sense, like when flesh opposes spirit, or by the works of the law, all flesh will not be justified before God. Flesh is humanity without the life of God dwelling in it. Humanity alienated from the life of God, which Paul says in Ephesians, or alienated in their minds. Well, they're alienated in their minds because they don't have the mind of God dwelling in them anymore. They have the mind of Satan dwelling in them. And so that's what flesh is. Flesh is humanity with all its powers and capacities and abilities apart from Christ, independent of Christ. But wait a minute, I thought there's no independent self. Well, there isn't, because they're not independent. They're joined to Satan. But they are independent of Christ. When you're an unbeliever, when you're a sinner, and you're apart from Christ, you're independent of Christ. You're not independent absolutely. You're joined to Satan. You're under the spiritual power of Satan. I mean, the Christmas hymn, God rest ye merry gentlemen. Christ came to save us from Satan's power. I mean, people in previous generations knew a lot better than Christians today. They said that in their hymns. Save us all from Satan's power. And, like Colossians, we were transferred from the dominion of darkness to the kingdom of the saints in light. And Acts 26, from the power of Satan to God. We were converted from the power of Satan to God. And I've never really understood how people can talk, well, we have this sinful, independent, sinful human nature, and then I wonder, well, then what's the reason for Satan? Why bother? We already have the source of temptation inside ourselves. There really is no need to talk of Satan at all. Maybe he started it all, but he can just go take a hike after that once he once he started it. But that's not the way the Bible portrays it. So as I was saying, flesh is humanity separated from the life of God. And that's why he can say in Romans 7:5, when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our bodies. When we were in the flesh. That means that flesh is a condition that no longer characterizes believers. Oh, wait a minute. I thought believers had sinful flesh. Isn't that what all the churches teach us, or many of them teach? That we still have sinful flesh, but we were in the flesh. And were in the Greek is in an imperfect tense, which is a continuous state in the past. But it's entirely in the past. Something has happened to change it so that we are no longer in the flesh. And in fact, in Romans 8, he says, you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if the Spirit of Christ lives in you. So you are not in the flesh. You are not one of these people that is in this condition where Satan is operating you through your bodily members. Let me read Ephesians 2:2. Or I'll start with verse 1. And you were dead in the trespasses and sins. You're dead because you have death himself dwelling in you. in which you once walked, following the age of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the flesh and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of humanity. So, we lived in the passions of the flesh. Why? Because we had the wrong spirit dwelling in us. The spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, which Paul describes and calls the prince of the power of the air. That's an interesting title, the ruler of the power of the air. Well, what is it about air? Air is universal and it's inescapable, and every human being breathes it in and out all the time. And so that's what the spirit now at work in the sons of disobedience is like to those who are in the world, the unbelieving world. He is the spiritual atmosphere they breathe in and out all the time. Everything they do reflects this spirit because he is, and in fact the word for at work is related to the word we use for energy, is powerfully, energetically at work in the sons of disobedience. And what he does is he constantly stirs up the passions of the flesh. Now, the passions of the flesh in the ancient world would have meant things like anger, lust, fear, covetousness, things that stir up these desires, but they're all the result of this indwelling spirit of evil, spirit of error. I mean, another passage from another author in the New Testament is 1 John 4:4. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. Well, by saying that there's another spirit then that's in the world, greater is he that is in you, that's plural, believers, as opposed to he that is in the unbelievers. He's not talking about a spirit that's at work and living in stones or trees or dogs or animals. He by world, he that is in the world, he means the world of people, of human beings. He means there's an actual spirit that dwells in human beings and operates within them. Just like Paul says, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. Well, that's everyone, because everyone is disobeyed except Jesus. That is the fate of humanity. Because Adam ate of the tree, he entered into that covenant relationship with humanity, that covenant union, that marriage with humanity. And like the marriage that God established, this marriage is till death do you part. Unfortunately, there is no divorce from Satan. Humanity cannot divorce themselves because human beings are vessels. Norman Grubb taught us about that. We have no power of our own. So what makes us think that we can break this covenant union with Satan? No, he has us in an iron grip, an unbelievably powerful iron grip. We have no power in relationship to Satan. And in fact, as Brian Coatney's Keeper's Creed says, I would do any sin if you did not keep me. And because the unbeliever is not kept by God, they can do any sin. All that it requires is being sufficiently provoked, or their situation in their lives or circumstances become bad enough that they could do any sin. And I've thought a lot about, and it's been a lot in the news about these shooters, the mass shooters that go into schools and kill children. And in fact, there's been at least 6 or 7 mass shootings since Uvalde, Texas. You'd think it's just, it was just a week, there's been 6 or 7 since then? This isn't an uncommon thing. And, people have brought up, it's mental illness. But it doesn't fit any category of mental illness that I've ever heard of in the catalog of mental illnesses in DSM, what the book called DSM-5, which is the catalog of mental illnesses. It's not mental illness. There might be mental illness involved, but that's not it. The problem ultimately is when you have Satan dwelling in people, and then you sufficiently humiliate and render people powerless enough that they will do anything to regain a sense of power. Even if it's, the power of life and death over others. Oh, no, I'm not powerless. I can take this gun and I can shoot people dead. I can shoot children dead. And, it's pure, ultimate self-for-self abuse of power. But it's ultimately that it's a combination of Satan already being in people. And so it means that if it weren't for the fact that God kept us, it could be any one of us, provided we had enough powerlessness, experiences of powerlessness and humiliation. And so, I'm just very grateful to God's keeping that God kept me from ever becoming that. I had actually sufficient experiences of powerlessness and humiliation as a child. And before I was saved, I was filled with hate and rage. And, and even people in the world, and maybe some Christians would say, I had justification to be angry and full of hate. But God protected me. God turned me around and allowed me to see, and this was even before I even read Norman, I had an image in my mind that I was chained to Satan in my heart. And I knew that hate, because, see, I knew my father was bipolar, and he'd go into these rages that were just demonic, satanic. The look in his eyes, it's like my father disappeared, and it was no longer him. It was Satan or a demon, or I just knew this is not him anymore. But then, I realized from my own feelings of rage and anger that this same spirit dwelt within me. And so when, I heard Norman teaching about, when we were sinners, it was Satan dwelling in us. I was already a Christian by this point. It's like, well, no, duh, of course. The same way the Africans, when you went, Sylvia, and presented to the Africans, it's like, oh, well, of course, everybody believes that. Don't you know that already? And so, it was strange to me that, when I go to church, and it's like people didn't really believe that Satan had dwelt in them. I even went to church once. This was 10th or 11th grade, and I was just excited about what I understood from, I don't know whether it was from Norman's teacher or was it Malcolm Smith at the time, but I wore this big placard into church and I wrote on it, "No vacancy." And in small print I put, "For Satan." And so people had to ask me, well, what did I mean by that? And, I wasn't ashamed to declare the truth that, that Satan no longer dwelt in me, that he had dwelt in me, and that there was no place for him any longer because now Christ dwelt in me. And, that was the faith of a child and the understanding of a child. But, I look back on it and, I don't know, it makes me happy that I did that, and so, anyway, that, that it's very important to understand what our condition was before we were saved, and also our condition before we know who we are, that it really is this horribly evil spirit that would stop at nothing to get for himself what he believes he deserves, that he is utterly self-seeking and power-seeking. He doesn't care about anyone other than himself, and that's who we were. If we don't see this, if we think we're good people or that we were basically good, then I don't know. If that's what people believe, I don't believe they're really saved. You have to face how evil you were to know how good Christ can be through you. To know redemption, you have to know what you're being delivered from. So this is why, to me, the whole preaching of the gospel in the churches, and I don't want to be overly negative and mean to the churches. I realize people teach what they know. And so they teach about the blood and how Jesus turned away the wrath of God by the sacrifice of himself on the cross, and the shedding of his blood atoned for our sins, and he purchased heaven for us so that we can go to paradise when we die. And that's all wonderful truth. But it's not enough. Because it doesn't deal with the root of the problem, because it leaves us in the same condition we always were, except now our sins are forgiven. We still have the root of sin dwelling within us. And if we don't realize it's a person, if we think it's just us, there's no way to deal with it. You can't get rid of yourself. So if you just have a sinful human nature, you're stuck. You're stuck for the rest of your life. You have the source of sin dwelling in you or in your body the rest of your life. You're going to sin the rest of your life. You're going to cause evil and harm and havoc wherever you go, because basically you're still a self for self. But God sees you as if you were righteous. Thanks. I mean, that's sort of like God fools himself, but I really know better that I'm still the same godless sinner I always was. That's really so old covenant. Because, in the old covenant, the sins of the people were covered by the blood sacrifices of the animals, and God gave them, and he was willing to go with them, but he was only willing to go with them if he was concealed behind a veil, with the cherubim guarding the way, the cherubim with the flaming swords guarding the path back to Eden. And no, you can have the glory in your midst, but it has to be concealed. You have no access to it. So it's like you have no access to the mind of God. You're separated from it. And but I'll still go with you, but you'll be sinning all the time. And okay, I understand that was a teaching moment for the people of God, that we had to go through a period of the law in human history. But I'm sure glad I'm not in that era. That in fact Christ did more than just simply forgive our sins. And this really gets to the body death of Jesus Christ. That he who knew no sin became sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Because, as we know, and Norman taught us, there are two elements to communion: the body, the blood, and the body. We all understand what the blood is for, and what the wine symbolizes. But what does the bread symbolize? It symbolizes the body broken for you. Well, what does that mean? How is that different from the blood? And I suppose that even scholars in the churches would say, oh, well, it really just all symbolizes the same thing. The broken body is the same as the spilled blood. But it really isn't. That it says that Jesus became sin. It doesn't just say that, and some translations have became a sin offering, but it's more than being a sin offering. He actually took the spirit of sin into his own body. I'd like to read from Romans 6, where I'm going to read from Romans 6:6. We know that our old humanity, I don't like translating it self because it's all of the humanity of all of us, it's collective, was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be nullified. In other words, that sin's power might be nullified in our bodies, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. For the one who has died has been set free from sin. Now, yes, we die to sin, but go to verse 10. For the death he died to sin once for all. Jesus died to sin. Think about how radical that really is. If Jesus died to sin, then at some point he must have been alive to sin. Well, it wasn't during his lifetime up to the cross, because he never sinned. So he was never alive to sin before the cross. And after he died, it was too late. So the only time he could be alive to sin when he was alive on the cross. Well, what does it mean that he was alive to sin? Well, it doesn't mean he sinned, because he never sinned. Because sin entered into his body. He became sin. And we know from Norman, sin is a spirit. Sin is not a human nature. But if you look at Romans 8:15, he says, "For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you received the spirit of sonship, by whom we cry, Abba, Father." Well, we know who the spirit of sonship is, the spirit of adoption. But who's the spirit of slavery? He calls it a spirit, right there. And in fact, he talks about the falling back into fear. Well, we know from Hebrews 2:14, he says, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself partook of these same things," this is Jesus, "that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil." Well, how does he destroy the devil? By his death. Well, not just atoning for sins through the blood, he destroys him who has the power of death by taking death into his very body, because his body dies. So his body is united with the one who holds the power of death, death personified. So he can destroy the one who has the power of death, the devil, and deliver all those who through their fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. That means the devil is the spirit of slavery mentioned back in Romans 7. The spirit of slavery and the spirit of sonship. And he mentions the spirit of slavery through fear, the slavery to fear. And that's what Hebrews 2 is describing. In fact, probably Hebrews is just expanding on what Paul said in Romans 8. Probably knew, if Paul wrote it, then Paul's expanding on what he said there. If Paul didn't write it, then it's just another writer expanding on what Paul said. So either way, it's still an expansion on Romans 8. So the body death of Christ delivers us and breaks the covenant with death. And God promises in Isaiah, I think it's 26, "I will nullify the covenant with death." Your covenant with death. And that's what he does. The covenant with Satan, who is death, who is sin. He is the spirit of sin and death. And the law of sin and death is Satan's law of sin and death. So he annuls that covenant. And he delivers us from slavery to sin through his body death, taking the spirit of sin into his body and then dying to it in his death. And because we enter into union with Christ through faith, through our trust in Christ, we participate in his death and in his death to sin. We die to sin because Christ died to sin. If Christ didn't die to sin, if Christ was never alive to sin in the first place, then I didn't die to sin. It's only possible for me to die to sin because Christ died to sin. And as a result, then I am raised to life with him. I'm united with him in his resurrection, and now I'm united to the spirit of life, to the life-giving spirit, the spirit of Christ. And so now I've been crucified with Christ. The Satan I that I was, that I used to be, the Satan-I, because I was never an alone I was a Satan I. And so through the body death of Christ, that covenant union with Satan, the covenant with death, is broken. It's shattered. Because ultimately, it's till death do you part. Well, so God arranges a death. He arranges our death in the death of Christ breaks the covenant with Satan, and then raises us up so that we can be married to a new husband, to him who is raised from the dead in Romans 7:4. So now we have a new covenant union, faith union with Christ. And so now, instead of it being no longer I, but the sin dwelling in me, now it's no longer I, but Christ living in me. Well, if before it was no longer I, but sin or Satan, and now it's no longer I, but Christ, when was it just me? Never. There's no time when it was just me. That's the delusion of Satan, and that's how Satan holds believers captive, through that lie that we are just ourselves, that we believed we were before we were saved. We have to have a renewed consciousness. And that's really the renewing of our mind, is when we wake up to the reality that we're not independent selves. And until, for a long time, it might not be for a long time, but for many of us, it's sometimes a long time that we're confessing the truth of Galatians 2:20 and taking God at his word, rather than our feelings or our experience, or our own thoughts, and trusting the wisdom of Galatians 2:20, and we stand on it until God gives the confirmation. Just as with salvation, we had to stand on, we're saved, even though, like in Campus Crusade for Christ, the caboose of the feelings, may or may not be there, and you have to trust God despite the feelings. Well, you have to do that with believing who you are. Yeah. And oftentimes, for Norman it took 2 years. For me, it was more gradual. I don't know, it wasn't just a single experience of confirmation. It was just sort of a gradual realization. I had that initial exciting revelation, and then I had multiple revelations after that. But God accomplishes it in a variety of different ways. It doesn't have to all be the same way. And so that's the wonder of it, and that's why I love listening to everybody's testimonies, because it's just, oh wow, God did it another way. Satan is always the same, the way he does things through people. Every year when I was teaching college freshmen, every year they would all come in doing the same things. Okay, some dyed their hair green or purple. Some would have earrings in various different places, and it's like, it was almost predictable. They were trying to be individuals, and they were all trying to be individuals in the same way so they could be accepted by each one another. And there was no individuality about it, because Satan has no creativity. Yes, that's been since Adam. It's never been. Yeah, it's silliness, really. Foolishness is really a better word. But I don't want to go on much longer. But I think I will just end there.